So a large part of how I define myself comes from the reference group of my family, and I think a really good example of this is when it comes to Hofstede's value of power distance. And in my family, we have like a really low power distance. My parents consider me in many ways an equal in like decision making, and they would never say to me when making a decision because we say so, because they understand that I have good ideas too, and sometimes they're wrong. Uh, and my parents and I are friends too, because we're very close, and the same thing happens with my older brothers. Another large part of how I define myself and my self concept comes from my reference groups, which tend to be sports teams and my church family, and this is because sports are really highly held in my family. For example, we have to let her in a sport, like it's kind of a rally tradition. And my mom has always worked in churches, and I've always had a really strong faith, so I know that I can trust those people to tell me when I'm not acting responsibly or I'm not acting like myself and kind of keep me in check. Also, because of my reference groups and how much I lean on them for my self esteem and knowing who I am, uh, I'm very confident in who I am, so I come across as very confident in my communication. I'm very confident in my perceptions and how I communicate with others. For example, when it comes to public speaking, I tend to be not quite as scared as some people are. Some people are definitely afraid of public speaking and communicating in that manner, but I'm not, and I feel like a lot of that comes from my theatrical background and growing up in the theater and with really, really dramatic people. And I've made myself look like an idiot so many times that I really just don't care anymore. And some more of this confidence when it comes to public speaking also comes from my family and the reference group of my family, because my grandfather on my dad's side would always make us, the youngest of the grandchildren, which is a lot of times me on that side, give speeches and say grace. And I have a really big family, so that's about 40 people that you're talking in front of as a 10-year-old, and I was always the shortest. So that's really intimidating, and being scared back then makes me a little less scared now, and that's really become a part of who I am and how I communicate with people. Another large part of who I am is that I'm from Minnesota and I'm a Minnesotan, and a lot of times when people think of Minnesota, they think of Minnesota nice, but that actually just means Minnesota passive aggressive, because that's all we do there, and there's lots of high context communication, and that's how I was raised and where I grew up, so that's how I communicate. And when I come across low context situations, when people are aggressive towards me or any confrontation, I tend to just break down and cry. Another one of Hofstede's values that I think really have defined myself are the femininity versus masculinity, and I tend to be more feminine, and I think a lot of this comes from growing up Lutheran and always being in a church with my mom and interpreting a lot of Jesus' teaching as we need to focus on people and being person-oriented versus being task-oriented and focusing on money and success. Another thing that makes me me is that I have divorced parents, and when it comes to having divorced parents and having two houses to split time between, there's a lot of communication and responsibility that comes with that. For example, I'm not gonna tell my mom, hey, I'm staying at my dad's, and then not actually stay there, and I know a lot of people who do that, but I feel like I'm more responsible to where I can trust my parents and they can trust me with how I communicate with both of them.